Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so today, just slightly more than a week after her co-defendant, Ruby Franke, pled guilty in this Utah child abuse case. Okay, today, JODI HILDEBRANDT has pled guilty to 4 counts of child abuse. But the first interesting thing I noticed in this change of plea hearing, okay, and I think this is very important, is that while this is not an Alford plea, in other words, JODI is accepting that there is some factual basis for her pleading guilty. Okay, so it's not pleading guilty with a protest that there's a factual basis. In other words, she accepts that there's some factual basis for the guilty plea, but her counsel is making it clear that they do not agree with all of the facts that are set forth in the actual document for the change of plea.
Your Honor, the agreement contains a factual basis. There are a few details in the factual basis that we are not in full agreement with. However, this is a guilty plea. It is not an Alford plea. The factual basis sets forth facts that we agree with, that Ms. Hildebrandt agrees with, that are sufficient for the court to accept her plea with respect to the 4 counts to which she is pleading guilty. And so we ask the court to accept her plea agreement.
So my guess is that for sentencing purposes, okay, for the sentencing hearing, okay, I think JODI HILDEBRANDT's defense team wants to reserve some objection, okay, to some of the more heinous facts, I think, especially in count 1, since count 1 does involve torture. I think, because it involves like some very graphic and very disturbing imagery of like hog tying and maybe causing like really severe injuries because of the bindings, and then using homeopathic remedies to treat the binding injuries as opposed to taking the male victim to the hospital. I think some of that might be so prejudicial and so kind of heinous that I think it looks as though JODI HILDEBRANDT's team wants to kind of maybe object to the worst of that and maybe try to argue and put forth maybe some evidence or testimony in the sentencing hearing that will kind of maybe lessen the impact of some of those allegations. And what that suggests is it's probably, since Ruby Franke did not really have any specific objections to any of the, even the worst facts in her plea agreement, it looks as though probably what really happened is that it probably wasn't Ruby who was doing the binding and the injuring. Okay, it probably was, if anybody was doing the bindings and the hog tying, it probably was apparently JODI or somebody working directly with JODI. And so JODI obviously has more interest in sort of managing those heinous, the most serious and disturbing facts out of the torture count, which is count 1. And so it's very clear that JODI is much more on the defensive here, and she has more, I think, to lose. And I think she's facing higher stakes at sentencing. As for the rest of the plea agreement, okay, I did have a chance to review the PDF of the plea agreement, and most of it is basically just a carbon copy of the plea agreement for Ruby Franke. Okay, so it does include the same boilerplate language that the parties are basically agreeing to consecutive sentences. But as I mentioned in my last video on the Ruby Franke change of plea, okay, while the parties can stipulate to consecutive sentences, the judge is not bound by any party stipulation. Okay, so judges, they can take into account the party stipulation, and the judge may in fact decide to make all the sentences run consecutive. The judge has that leeway. The judge has that discretion. Okay, but the judge is not by any means bound by what the parties stipulate to. So the judge may decide, let's say for Ruby Franke, may decide to make count 1 run consecutive to the other counts, but maybe the other counts, if the judge feels like it, they could run concurrently. Okay, but maybe for, let's say, JODI HILDEBRANDT, maybe he'll just have a different attitude and he may just make them all run consecutive. The judge is not bound by what the parties stipulate. And so we can see why JODI would have a motive here to really try to do everything she can to sort of minimize the most heinous aspects of count 1, because that could actually provoke the judge maybe to be more inclined to actually accept their stipulation and actually give her like a big time consecutive sentence. So to summarize the impact and significance of JODI's guilty plea today, okay, I think number 1, the most important thing is that they're trying to sort of take the sails out of Ruby Franke's guilty plea. Okay, in other words, Ruby Franke's guilty plea was predicated on Ruby's promise to testify truthfully against JODI HILDEBRANDT. Okay, so that was the predicate of Ruby's change of plea, right? And so now there's not going to be a trial. Okay, Ruby Franke's guilty plea would only have big power over Jodi Hildebrandt if there were actually a trial. Okay, and I think Jodi Hildebrandt's defense team has determined that really they don't have a lot to gain out of trying to go to trial. I think they realize they're going to lose at trial. And I think they also realize that Ruby Franke would give a devastating testimony at trial. And I think Jodi Hildebrandt's defense team feels that a sentencing hearing is a more compact and manageable setting in order to sort of flesh out and dispute, let's say, the areas of the, let's say, count one that I think Jodi Hildebrandt wants to try to minimize. Okay, so obviously at the sentencing hearing, I assume that Ruby Franke is going to testify. Okay, I'm assuming that, right? But I'm also assuming that they think that a sentencing hearing is a more compact and manageable space as opposed to a trial. Okay, to sort of address maybe the differences between what maybe Ruby's going to testify to and what I think Jodi's team is going to try to attack. Okay. And I think they feel that a sentencing hearing is just a more compact and manageable setting to mitigate the worst allegations of count one. Now, finally, as to what we can expect for an actual sentence. Okay. Now, I have to admit, I work mostly in the federal system. Okay. So the work I do in criminal defense is mostly in federal court, and I do a little bit in Florida with Florida state cases. Okay. So I don't really have a lot of experience with Utah state law, but I do understand, having looked into it a bit, that Utah, basically the judge will just decide whether the sentences run concurrently or whether they run consecutively. Okay, so the judge will determine that. And then the actual length of the sentence, as I understand it, is actually determined by the parole board. Okay, so very interesting. I think both Jodi and Ruby are going to have exactly the same defense strategy after the sentencing hearing. Okay, when they actually go before the parole board and the parole board actually assesses them for the actual length of the sentence. Okay, and so what I'm thinking is that both are going to emphasize, respectively, each in their different way, basically a theme of rehabilitation. So, for example, in Ruby's case, Ruby has already stated publicly through her attorneys, okay, that basically she is not such a bad person and that she's been basically influenced by Jodi Hildebrandt. Okay, so basically, Ruby's going to go to the parole board and basically say, as she awaits her initial sentence, she's basically going to suggest to them that, hey, I'm not really that bad. Okay, basically, Jodi has made me this way. So obviously, Jodi's defense team has a much more challenging task as they approach the parole board. Okay, now their first task is actually at sentencing. Okay, even though they've pretended in their plea agreement that they're agreeing to consecutive sentences, obviously, they still want to hold out that hope that maybe the judge won't give out everything consecutive. So they're going to try to minimize what they can at the sentencing hearing. But I think they're expecting they're going to get consecutive sentences. In other words, you have to be kind of conservative. You have to sort of expect the worst. So I'm assuming that Jodi Hildebrandt's team is expecting the worst at sentencing, meaning they're expecting consecutive, but then they need a strategy for approaching the parole board to actually set the actual length of the sentence. Okay, and so what I'm assuming is that Jodi Hildebrandt's team has a tougher challenge here, because basically, since Jodi was the mastermind and she was the one in a better position to, like, say, brainwash people through her connections coaching organization. Okay, Jodi's gonna have a tougher time convincing the parole board that she's a good candidate for rehabilitation. So I think the big summary here is that I think obviously Jodi Hildebrandt is in a worse position right now. Okay, I think she realizes it, and I think her defense realizes it. You can see that her defense team is actually more defensive about the facts of the plea agreement, and you can sort of see that they have more anxiety approaching sentencing than Ruby Franke's team. Okay, so obviously Jodi Hildebrandt is in a much more vulnerable position, and I think she's in a position for a much more serious prison term than Ruby Franke. However, obviously, Jodi Hildebrandt's defense team needs to do something, and they need to have some plan. So I'm assuming that what they're going to try to do is they're going to take their lumps at sentencing. They're going to try to fight the worst facts at sentencing, but they're going to take their lumps, and they may get consecutive sentences. But then they're going to go to the parole board, and while Jodi is in a much more powerful position with her connections organization, and while she is in a better position to brainwash people, what she's going to have to do is go to the parole board and say, hey, look, I'm coming with contrition. I'm saying I'm sorry for this. I'm admitting to everything, and I'm ready to begin my healing journey, basically. And that's really all that Jodi Hildebrandt can do, actually. I mean, the only thing that really matters to the parole board is basically what level of rehabilitation can they expect. Okay. And also, like, in determining early parole is based on rehabilitation. So if the parole board from the very beginning has people that are just admitting their crimes, that are just showing remorse, taking responsibility, okay, that's going to minimize the initial sentence. And it's also going to set a record with the parole board so that eventually when they do come up for parole, they're going to have a track record always pointing in the direction of rehabilitation. Okay, so all that Jodi Hildebrandt can do is maximize her opportunity and minimize her exposure, which is basically she has to be as remorseful as possible. And then down the line, when she actually when she actually comes up for early probation, she has to present the best case that she was always pointed towards rehabilitation, and that in fact she has rehabilitated herself. So that's basically the only direction they can go. And so I expect Jodi Hildebrandt just to present a very strong case for herself, that I am 100% remorseful. I take 100% responsibility. And then while she's in prison, everything she does has to look like rehabilitation. So, it's pretty simple. Obviously, Jodi Hildebrandt is in a worse position. Obviously, I think Ruby Franke, just for whatever reason, she just looks better because I guess relatively between these two people, Ruby Franke is the less powerful. But Jodi Hildebrandt's going to have to still play the rehabilitation game the best she can. And I guess if I had to predict it, I think Jodi Hildebrandt's going to get a little bit longer of a sentence. She'll probably get more consecutives than Ruby Franke. But I think down the road, if Jodi Hildebrandt actually does well in prison and really does actually look like a person who's rehabilitating herself, she could also be up for early parole. So I guess if I had to guess, I guess we could see, I would predict that Ruby Franke could be out on early parole in as early as 2 or 3 or 4 years. Like say maybe between 2 to 4 years, we could see Ruby Franke on early parole. But I would think that Jodi Hildebrandt could be on early parole maybe in the 4 year mark, or 3 to 4 to 5 year mark. Just depending on how well they do in prison. So anyway, just a rough guess. I mean, I could be wrong, but it's just based on my experience in criminal defense. And we'll just have to see what happens. But appreciate your patience, and thanks for watching.